Okay. So welcome back, everyone, and welcome to this first scientific session of the Journées Plénières. And I'm very happy to welcome Michael Wooldridge, that is a professor at University of Oxford, and that is one of the preeminent member of the multi-agent system topic. Michael was chair of most of the main conference on AI, so ISBN, ECAI. It was editor of the main journals also, and so he's a RAI fellow, AAA fellow, and ACM fellow, and so we are very pleased that. He works both on the foundation and on the application on multi-agent systems. And we invited him now because he recently published a very interesting book, but maybe the AI do not want me to show the book. So he wrote an history of AI, so the road to conscious machines, the story of AI. That is a very interesting historical book, so with a history of the discipline, and that during this history basically can be used as an introduction of the field with the historical question and the current one and the question to come. So it's both interesting for people that doesn't know AI at all and that knows. Also that people that know very well. So I learned a lot of things with this book. And so we thought that it was a perfect introduction for this event, because so we will in the session this afternoon we will have something of the perspective, so on the current and future question on AI, and tomorrow we will have some session about discussing what is AI and what is the link between artificial intelligence and human one. So, so this talk is a perfect introduction for all these questions. And so, Michael, thanks again for accepting to give the talk. And then I let you share your screen and take the.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Let me just share my screen. Okay, thank you for the very nice introduction. The first thing to say is obviously I wish we could all be together in person. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to be with you all in France as was originally planned. Obviously that can't happen. We were just discussing before we came on when that might happen, when we might have the opportunity to do that. We will see. This pandemic has taken us by surprise and wrong-footed us so many times. But I'm optimistic that we will start to see each other face to face at some time in the next year. Okay, so the first thing to say is this is not a technical talk. This is quite a high level overview of some historical trends in AI and what worked with them and what didn't work with them. I think there's genuinely lots to be excited about, but you will notice that a lot of the talk is about trying to manage people's expectations. So let me explain where this talk came from, first of all. So I was sat in my office in Oxford in 2014, and the telephone rang, and it was the BBC. It was the BBC news desk. And they said, there's this guy, Elon Musk, and he says artificial intelligence might be the end of humanity, and we want somebody to come and talk about what that is. So I didn't do it, as it happens. And the reason I didn't do it is quite interesting. I thought they'd get somebody who knew more than I did. Actually, that didn't happen, as it turned out. And then a couple of weeks later, it was Stephen Hawking, the late, great Stephen Hawking, you know, one of the world's great scientists. And he was saying similar things. Artificial intelligence might mean the end of the human race. And I've been working in AI for 30 years, and I didn't recognize my field in these kind of comments. And something dawned on me. And it dawned on me that I was looking around, sort of expecting that somebody was going to stand up and talk about what AI really is versus the Hollywood dream and the Hollywood nightmares. And nobody was doing that. And so the book that Sebastian referred to, and this talk sort of covers a lot of the territory that the book covers, was really an attempt to do that, to stand up and say, actually, look, this is what AI is all about. There was lots to be genuinely excited about with AI, but this is how you need to shape your thinking about the field. This is what AI people actually do, and how they actually do it. Okay, so I say it's not a technical talk. So the first thing to say is AI is obviously very, very big news these days. So this is a quote from a few years back. AI is bigger than electricity. So who said that? Was it some kind of crazy person who said that? Was it Donald Trump? No, it wasn't. It was Andrew Ng. He was research director at Baidu, one of the giant Chinese tech companies. He's former director of Stanford University AI Lab, one of the world's great centers for AI research. And he's one of the founders of Coursera. I looked last week, Coursera valued now at nearly $5 billion on the US market. So he should know what he's talking about. And he's making a very big statement here, right? AI is bigger than electricity. And yet some people think it's even bigger than that. AI is bigger than fire and electricity. This is Sundar Pichai. He's CEO of Google, right? So if anybody should know, if anybody should know what they're talking about, it should surely be Sundar. This is one of the most influential people in the tech field. But then some people think it's even bigger than that. So AI is God. So who said this? So if you have some time afterwards in the coffee breaks or whatever, go and Google this name. It's a fascinating story, Anthony Levandowski. So he had this idea. He said, this is what he claimed. He said, look, eventually AI will be our ruler. So we may as well start worshiping it now. So I'll set up a religion to worship artificial intelligence. If you want to understand the truth of what Lewandowski was doing there in founding his religion, you have to understand that in the United States, religions get tax breaks. So follow the money is always wise advice if you want to understand statements like this. He's also got, I have to say, a very interesting backstory in general. So you might, I say, go and have a look, Google that name during the coffee break. So what are we to make of AI when some very serious figures are making extremely grand claims about what AI is and what it's going to be capable of? And so disentangling all of that is what this talk is all about. So the first thing to say is there are varieties of artificial intelligence. And I have to say, the terminology that I introduced on this slide, I'm not introducing it, but the terminology that I use on this slide, actually, I'm not personally tremendously comfortable with. But anyway, this is the terminology that people seem to use. So the first is the idea of general AI. So what is general AI? General AI is the Hollywood dream of AI. It's the idea that we can build machines which have the full range of intellectual capabilities that human beings have. Perhaps even machines that have consciousness in the same way that human beings have. And associated with this dream of general AI, machines which can do everything that a human being could do, goes this idea of the singularity. And the story of the singularity is a great story, the singularity. This is how it goes. It says at some point, machines will be more intelligent than people. And the moment they're more intelligent, they can start applying their improved intelligence to making themselves even smarter. And then those smarter machines can apply their improved intelligence to making themselves even smarter. And at that point, you can see where this is going, right? This sounds like the narrative of a Hollywood movie, and indeed some good Hollywood movies have been made around that idea. But for reasons that I'll come back to repeatedly throughout this talk, I think really it is nothing more than science fiction. But it's a fascinating idea and very widely discussed, the idea of the singularity. And another idea that goes with that is the idea of superintelligence. So superintelligence is the idea that we have machines whose intelligence in a general sense far exceeds that of any human being, that are vastly more capable than any human being could be. So this is great fun to talk about over a beer or a good glass of French wine, I should say. I would love to do that with you at some point in the very near future. But the truth is, actually, In my view, there has been very little progress on general AI. We really don't understand very much about it at all. There is little serious activity. I mean, to be frank, a lot of the work on general AI is kind of lunatic fringe. Not all of it by any means. There is some respectable researchers doing work in this area, but a lot of it is pseudoscience, bluntly, and it's controversial. And in truth, general AI does not enter into the mainstream thread of AI research. If you go to one of the big AI conferences, the IJCAI conference, the Triple AI conference, or one of the machine learning conferences, you know, general AI is something that gets discussed, as I say, over a beer or a glass of wine. There's very little activity on general AI in the mainstream scientific thread of the conference. So if we're not doing that, if we're not building machines that have the full range of capabilities that humans have, what the hell are we doing? Well, what we're doing is something which has come to be called narrow AI. And it's really a very simple idea. There are some things which machines can do, which people cannot. And there are some things which seem to be very difficult for us to get machines to be able to do. So in narrow AI, what we tend to focus on is the idea of getting machines to do things which people currently can't do. Or to put it another way, extending the range of things that machines can do to encompass things which currently require brains and potentially nervous systems, possibly human brains or maybe animal brains and nervous systems and potentially bodies as well. And I emphasize another idea that I can come back repeatedly because it is incredibly important, is that we're typically focused on very, very narrow, very specific tasks. What might those be? Things like recognizing faces in pictures would be an idea of a very narrow task, which until recently was something that people could do very easily, but seemed to resist our attempts to get machines to do that. Now, in truth, most AI research is on this topic. Most AI research, if you go to a conference, will be focused around an activity like facial recognition or job shop scheduling or playing a computer game like Go or chess, a very, very narrow activity, and trying to build computer programs that can do that very, very well. Now, the reason that there is so much hype about AI recently is that we've seen a lot of progress recently in areas like recognizing faces in pictures and in automated translation, ideas that I'm going to come back to throughout this talk later. And this progress, for example, progress in building computer Go programs that can play, to all intents and purposes, better than any human being can play, certainly better than if you go up and pick somebody off the street at random. You know, we have Go programs that can play better than anybody you're going to be able to pick randomly off the street. That encourages you, the fact that you have this superhuman ability in this very narrow program encourages you to believe that, you know, we must be on the brink of some kind of general AI superintelligence breakthrough, because I'm not a very good chess player or a Go player, you know, and those tasks seem to require great intelligence in humans. So if we can build programs that can do those narrow tasks which require great intelligence in humans, it encourages us to believe that we must be on the brink of some general breakthrough in intelligence. But that absolutely isn't the case. And another idea that I'm going to come back repeatedly and hammer back in this talk is that these programs which can do very well on these narrow tasks are just programs which are highly optimized to do one tiny thing very well. Okay, so narrow AI then, I guess I said most of this, is focused on developing programs for very, very narrow specific problems which currently require human brains and maybe nervous systems, not necessarily human brains. And superhuman performance, the kind of, you know, breathless phrase that you read about when you read about these advances, only means superhuman on that very specific task. And there's no sense of understanding or comprehending the task at hand. And typically there's no ability to transfer that capability. A program that's very good at recognizing faces can't do other things like play a game of Go. And I'll come back to those ideas later on as well. So that's narrow AI. Now, I have to say that's the expression that's come to be used to describe this body of work. It's actually quite a recent expression. I say I actually more than 30 years. It's 30 years since I got my PhD, but I've been a researcher since 1989. And for almost all of that time, nobody used this expression narrow AI. And of course, it isn't really used very much within the AI community, except when you're trying to communicate the ideas that I'm trying to communicate now, to distinguish what we're doing from general AI. So I've talked about, the idea that we're trying to extend the range of things that computers can do. So it's interesting to look at how easy and how hard it was for us to get computers to do certain tasks, and to ask, why was it easy? Why was it hard? So we can start out with arithmetic. So arithmetic, if we go back to the late 1940s, Alan Turing, the very first program, the very first real program that Alan Turing wrote for a computer was to do long division, a basic arithmetic task. And I think he wrote that in something like 1948, 49. Okay, so the first computers, all they did was huge amounts of arithmetic. And because people find arithmetic tedious and error prone, and a lot of people just don't like doing it, the fact that we had machines that could do arithmetic very, very quickly and very, very accurately suggested to them, to outsiders, that actually we had machines that were kind of electronic brains. And of course, we now realize if you have the briefest exposure to computer programming, you realize that's not the case. The point with arithmetic is that there are very simple recipes for doing arithmetic. And you were taught, and I was taught, these recipes when we were at school. And if you follow those recipes closely, you'll be able to do arithmetic. And those recipes are just nothing more than computer programs. And it was very straightforward to translate those recipes, those lists of detailed instructions, into computer programs. So the very first lesson you learn when you do computing is that when you have a problem for which you have a recipe that can, with detailed instructions, that's very often easily translated into a computer program. So arithmetic was solved right back in the earliest days of computing. Then we move forward quite some time actually, and we move on to challenges like playing board games. Now, essentially any board game that a normal person might play for leisure purposes, that is, when I say a normal person, I mean somebody who's not obsessed with board games and obscure board games, games like chess and checkers and Go and so on, they are effectively solved. We have computer programs that, for all intents and purposes, can play them better than people can. Now, the fascinating thing about a game like chess is that if you think about the arithmetic example, where there were simple recipes, actually we have simple recipes to play chess. And the simple recipe for playing chess is, here you are on a board, here's the board, and you're playing white. What you need to do is to figure out what to do. You just look at all the alternatives. What could I do? What might my counterpart do in response to that? How might I respond to those counter moves? And so on. And you can very naturally see a tree of possibilities expanding. And if you find in some part of that tree that you're winning, well, you've now essentially solved the game. This is what you do. You just follow the path through that tree. Unfortunately, it doesn't work in practice for a very simple reason. And the reason it doesn't work in practice is that the number of alternatives that you would have to consider is astronomically large. Astronomically, for once, in this case, really meaning what it says, the number of alternatives being larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So no realistic computer would ever be able to use that recipe in practice. So we need something else if we're going to do board games. What do we need? We need some artificial intelligence. And we'll talk about how that works later. Recognizing faces in a picture. This is difficult for a completely different reason. This is a challenge of perception. Perception arises time and time again in real-world applications of artificial intelligence. And what does it mean? It means interpreting what you're seeing. Interpreting your senses, the sounds you're hearing, the things that you're perceiving through your eyes, the things that you're touching and so on, the smells that you're smelling, interpreting all of that and making sense of it. And perception, which is something that we all do, without even thinking about it, turns out to be tremendously difficult for people. Okay, but nevertheless, playing board games, recognizing faces in a picture, these are things that were pretty much solved. Then we moved on to things that we might solve soon. Driving cars. What is the hard problem about driverless cars? People have been trying to do this seriously, trying to build driverless cars since the 1950s. It now feels like we're close. How close, we could debate, but at some point in the next few decades, it seems plausible that we will see very wide scale take-up of driverless car technology in some form on our roads. So what was the hard problem? If we've been working on it since the 1950s, why did it take so long? It is not the problem of whether to speed up or slow down or turn left or to right. That's actually, we have recipes for that. It is not the problem of deciding, if on one side of the room there is a freckle-faced child, and on the other side, on one side of the road there's a freckle-faced child, on the other side of the road there's a nun. Which one do you swerve and kill? Right, the famous trolley problem. That is not the hard problem about driverless cars. That's actually a complete red herring for driverless car technology. All of the challenge about driverless car technology, in my belief, is to do with perception. Understanding where the car is and what is around you, that is a stop sign, that is a pedestrian, that is a lorry which is parked on the other side of the road, and so on. And no matter how many sensors you equip a driverless car with, cameras and infrared rangefinders and all the rest of it, all they're providing is a barrage of data. The perception problem is to interpret that data and understand that is a stop sign, that is a pedestrian on a bicycle, that is a lorry, and so on. Okay, so perception is the big challenge in driverless cars. Interpreting spoken language, what you're doing now, most of you are listening to a language that is not your native language, so you're doing a complex cognitive challenge. Can we interpret spoken language? Can we reliably translate in a high quality way from one language to another? This is, the fact that we have technology that can do this even a little bit, I think is really remarkable, and something that I will come back and talk to later. So we've made huge progress on those problems, and really high quality systems will come soon. But then we're in the territory of understanding a story and answering questions about it, inventing funny jokes, interpreting what's going on in a picture, not just saying that's a picture of Michael Wooldridge, but interpreting it. Michael is looking angry, and he's looking he's looking at his child, so he's probably angry at his child, something like that. Interpreting what's going on in a picture, and finally writing interesting stories. And I don't just mean 3-line stories, I mean like Harry Potter books, a very large, sustained piece of work which engages us in an intellectually interesting way and appeals to us in terms of understanding of the human condition. We have no clue about these. I have to say, there is a research strand in AI about writing jokes, but the truth is, I'm sorry to tell you that actually those jokes are really not very funny at the moment. And I think it's going to be quite a while before we get to those. So why are the hard things hard? Well, we can draw some general lessons from this. The first is perception. This was a big bugbear for AI for a very, very long time. Anything to do with vision, speech, and so on. Those are hard problems for artificial intelligence historically, but problems that we've made real progress on recently, and I'll explain why we've made real progress. Long-term reasoning. This is to do with understanding how the consequences of what you're doing now relate to the rewards you're going to get in the future. So the standard example is smoking, right? So why do people smoke? We know that smoking is bad for us, right? That it has long-term health consequences. So why do we do it? Well, the problem is that they are long-term health consequences. You have a cigarette, you don't get cancer the next day, you get it in 20 years' time. If you had a cigarette and you got cancer the next day, my bet is that nobody would be smoking today. So, and just as we have difficulty with scenarios like that, so it's difficult with computers. And it's called the credit assignment problem, technically is what that problem's called. Understanding the consequences of our actions with respect to how well or how badly we're going to do at some point in the future. That's a hard problem for computers. Dealing with poorly defined problems, when we throw a machine into settings where there are no rules, we don't know what the rules are, and you have to make sense of things from scratch. That's very difficult. Problems that involve judgment as opposed to precise rules. So taxes are good and taxes are bad. Taxes are good because they allow us to build hospitals and they fund schools, but they're bad. Why? Because they depress innovation and entrepreneurship and so on, and they take away choices from consumers. Well, I'm prepared to accept that both of those statements are true, but then how do I make sense of this conflicting information? That is a hard problem for computers that people have been dealing with for decades. The one bullet point seems to have dropped from my slide, which is the one that's related to the number of possibilities being too astronomically large. So when we say, what we say is the search space, the number of possibilities that we have to look through to find the best outcome, when that is very, very large, or what's called combinatorial reasoning problems. These are hard for computers. There should be a bullet point. Obviously, I accidentally deleted it somehow. So these are all things, whenever we see those, and this is not an exhaustive list, these are just some of the highlights. Whenever we see these, we know we're in the territory of things that are going to be difficult for us. And the really interesting one for the purposes of today's talk is perception. Why? Because we spent a lot of time trying to deal with perception, and we've made a lot of progress on it recently. So, very often we find that the things that we're looking at in the mainstream conferences on AI really fall into two categories. And those categories are two possibilities. The first is that we have the algorithms that solve the problem in principle, but they don't work in practice because they require too much time or memory. And this is the case with playing chess and just doing what we call exhaustive search, looking through all the alternative. The algorithm is trivial, but it doesn't work in practice, but it requires astronomically too much time and memory. And in that case, when we encounter problems like that, we need something else. That's where AI comes in. The second possibility is that actually conventional software techniques just don't give us a clue how to solve the problem. So a problem here is recognizing faces. What is a recipe for recognizing a face in a picture? Well, you could try to write it down, but you wouldn't make much progress. And I know this because people spent decades trying to do this. We need something different in that case. It's not just a conventional algorithm. We need something different. And that something different is really about machine learning. Now, it is remarkable if you go and look at the proceedings of a big AI conference, how much of the work in AI falls into these two categories. We can solve it in principle, but we can't solve it in practice because the algorithms that we have require too much time and memory. So we need to inject something else into them. The thing that we inject is often heuristics, rules of thumb, which try to guide us to a solution. Or the second possibility, actually, we just don't have a recipe to do. We don't know how to write down a recipe for doing this, so we need something else. And the thing that we need is machine learning, and very often what are called neural networks. So how do we go about it? And Sebastian said that, I was going to say a little bit about the history, and really the history for me is we can divide into two different approaches to artificial intelligence. And again, go and look at the proceedings of an AI conference. You will find that it's remarkable, I think, how much of work in AI falls into these two different categories. And I've given them the name top-down versus bottom-up for a reason which I hope will be obvious. That's not a technical term. That's not a term that's really used in the AI community, but I think it does describe quite accurately what we're trying to do. So how do AI researchers build programs that are going to do the things like recognizing faces or automated translation or whatever? How do we actually do it? What are the techniques that we use? So the first possibility is with top down, what we do is we give the computer a model or a theory of the problem. We give it our expertise about the problem, and the computer uses our expertise. The second possibility is that we don't do that at all. We just show the machine what we want it to do, and the machine learns how we are, what we want it to do. We show the machine almost by example what we want it to do, and the machine learns from our example. So I haven't told you exactly how either of those two things work, so let's start to do that. So the top-down approach first. So this dominated, the top-down approach dominated from around about 1956, when the field was founded, through to, I would say, the late 1980s. And so the idea of the top-down approach is as follows. Suppose you want a machine which can do automated translation. Then the top-down approach says what you do is you go to an expert on translation, let's say from French to English, and you talk to them and you find out what expertise they use when they do this problem. What knowledge do they make use of when they do translation? What expertise do they use? What knowledge do they use? We find out what knowledge that we use. We then code that in a form that the computer can use in what we call a knowledge representation language. We encode that human expertise in a machine processable knowledge representation language, and we give that to the machine. And the basic hypothesis of this approach is that if we can give the machine the right expertise about a problem, then it will be able to solve that problem. Okay, this approach has lots that's appealing about it. One thing which is very appealing about it is that the theory underpinning it is very, very elegant. It turns out that the languages, the knowledge representation languages, which we use to do this, are very closely related to languages from mathematics, formal logic that's widely used in mathematics. And it's very transparent. We can look at the knowledge that the machine is using. If it's solving a problem and we say, why did you do that? It can say, well, look, I used this piece of knowledge that you gave me, and it's very, very transparent. And if there's a bug in that knowledge, we can fix that knowledge. We can tweak it. We can give it slightly different piece of knowledge, a refined piece of knowledge. So on the slide, I've given you a couple of examples. On the right-hand side of the slide is a piece of knowledge. This is sort of rewritten in an English format, but the idea is this is what's called a script. And this was a script that was developed by, this technique that was developed by Roger Schank and I believe Samuel Abelson. Apologies if I got your name wrong, Abelson, your first name wrong, Abelson. But the idea is this is a program which can understand stories. And Schank and Abelson's idea was when you understand a story, what you use is knowledge about ordinary human circumstances, like going to a restaurant. And in this case, what would your knowledge consist of? Well, it would consist of knowledge of who participates in this scenario. There's a customer, a waiter, a cook, and the cashier. There are some conditions, what would typically be required for this to happen? Well, the customer would be hungry. The various props, the artifacts in the world that would be used, there would be a food, there would be a table in the restaurant, there would be money, a menu, and a tip. And then there would be a sequence of events. Customer enters restaurant, customer goes to table, waiter brings menu, customer orders food, and so on. And at the bottom, it says the main concept is 6, which is customer eats food, which is the point of going in a restaurant. So how does this work if you're trying to understand a story? Well, imagine that the story involves going to a restaurant, but that we get to the customer orders food, but then we never get to step 5, waiter brings food. Well, this you could imagine as being part of a comedy, right? The customer sits there waiting for the food and the food's not arriving. And this is kind of a humorous circumstance. Whereas, the waiter brings bill to the customer, but then the customer leaves restaurant without giving the money, without going through step 9. This is now a crime drama, right? The customer is escaping without paying the restaurant. So now we're in a crime scene. So this was a knowledge representation formalism script developed by Schank and Abelson in the early 1970s, very influential in its time for trying to understand stories. In the bottom left of the screen, there's a piece of knowledge, and this is literally I talked about knowledge representation languages. This is in the knowledge representation language that was used by a very influential computer program called Mycin. And Mycin was an expert in understanding diseases, blood diseases in humans. And what does this rule say? This is a rule. It's a piece of if-then knowledge. It says, if you know this, then you can conclude this. What does it say in its obscure Mycin way? It says, well, if this is gram negative, that is, if you stain it with this is a standard test that you do for bacteria in the lab. You try and stain them and see whether they stain with different chemicals. And if it doesn't stain, it's gram negative. And if its morphology is rod, which means it looks like a rod and it's an anaerobic bacteria, it doesn't use oxygen, then you conclude with probability 0.6 that it's the identity of the bacteria you're looking at is bacteroids. Now, the point is that's a discrete chunk of human knowledge that's been written down in this rule form, which can then be processed by a machine. The machine can make use of that knowledge. How can it make use of it? If it's looking at a bacteria which doesn't stain with the gram test, its morphology is rod and it's anaerobic, then the machine can conclude that what it's looking at is bacteroids with probability 0.6. And you don't have to work hard to understand how knowledge like that can be used in programs which diagnose the causes of blood diseases in humans. Mycin was very influential, and it was interesting for a number of reasons, but one of them is it was one of the first programs that had superhuman capability. They did some experiments, which I think are probably, it's fair to say, are rather crude by the standard of today's experimentation, but basically they looked at how mycin performed compared to medical practitioners, and basically it performed rather well. This is the idea of the top-down approach. What we're doing is we're extracting knowledge, like these rules about understanding understanding how to interpret bacteria and the causes of blood diseases in humans, or scripts about understanding stories and so on, and we're giving it to the machine. And then the most famous example of this top-down approach is the Psych experiment. So the Psych experiment was, or rather is, because it actually still exists, you can go and Google it, was an expensive attempt to build general AI using explicitly coded knowledge of the world. So the Psych Hypothesis, which was basically formulated by Psych's founder, a man called Doug Lenert in the United States in the early 80s, is Lenert's hypothesis was that human general intelligence, the Hollywood dream, the stuff that I was very skeptical about at the beginning, is basically a problem of knowledge. If you have a machine that has sufficient knowledge, then it will have general AI. So what knowledge would you need for general AI? Well, what Lenert said was that Psych would need to know everything, let me repeat that, everything that a reasonably educated person would know, such as red taps produce hot water, the sky is often blue, you can't eat Kansas, cats are often pets, but not always. Everything. Now just think about this for a moment. Think about all the knowledge that you have used about your environment about the world since the moment you woke up this morning. You know, you hear a noise out on the street, that's an alarm, which means that, you know, potentially somebody's breaking into a car. Which means that there's a criminal nearby or something like that. All of the knowledge that you use every day would have to be explicitly written down in rules, and the language was more sophisticated than this, but basically it was a language not dissimilar to the mycin language that we saw on this slide, at the bottom of this slide, would have to be written down and given to the machine. And they had, at the peak of the Psych project in the mid-80s, they had rooms full of people, what were called knowledge engineers, that were busy doing that, writing down these rules, giving it to the machine. Well, it didn't work as hoped. And if you read my book, I talk about, you know, how it didn't work and why it didn't work. And it's really interesting to look at why it didn't work. The first is nobody has the vaguest idea about what we know. Right? We just learn stuff without even knowing that we've learned it in the world. And we can't articulate much of what we know about the world. But also it turns out that a tiny little gap, a rule which just connects this body of knowledge over here to this body of knowledge over here, you know, if we miss that rule, then the whole thing falls apart. It just fails on really, really, really trivial tasks that a human would never fail on. So the reason that it's kind of notorious, I mean, it did lots of good things. It was a scientifically interesting experiment and we learned a lot from Psych. But the reason that actually we hold Psych up as being an example of actually a bad AI research is really the inflated claims that Doug Lenert made about it. He claimed that within a few years, Psych would know enough to be able to educate itself, just read books. And he made lots of other programs. And actually recently I saw he claimed that, you know, actually Psych is now ready. It's now solved the problem of general intelligence. I'm very, very skeptical about this. So, you know, it's basically often cited as one of many examples, and there are many, of AI hubris, the idea of the AI researchers keep promising the world and then failing to deliver. And in the area, the top-down approach, the area of knowledge-based AI, the idea that we build AI systems by giving them human knowledge, it's often held up as this is the supreme example of where knowledge-based AI didn't work. So what's the alternative then? Well, the alternative is the bottom-up approach. What we do is we show the machine what we want it to do. And a bit more technically, what we're doing is what we want the machine to do is we want the machine to learn a mapping from inputs to outputs. Given this input, this is the output that I would want you to produce. Given this input, this is the output that I would want you to produce. So the next slide illustrates in a bit more detail. And the simplest form of machine learning, or it's not simple at all, but the most basic and obvious form of machine learning is supervised learning. And what this is on the right-hand side, this is what we're doing with supervised learning. What we do is we start by training the machine by giving it an input and the desired output. So the input here is a picture of a man, and the desired output is Alan Turing, because indeed it is a picture of Alan Turing. Again, we give it another piece of training data in the form of an input-output pair. Given this input, this picture here of a child, this is the output I would want you to produce. Given this picture of a man, this is the desired output that I would want you to produce. And in the end, the goal of supervised machine learning is that if I show the machine a picture, it would be able to produce the desired output, the output that I would want it to produce, given that input. Okay, so I haven't said anything about how it does that learning yet, and I will do in a moment. So the first thing to say here, it's obvious on this slide, but actually it turns out to be incredibly important, is that data is important. Data, I have to say, I did not really get until just a few years ago how crucial data was for machine learning. Having well-curated data sets, carefully curated and produced data sets is absolutely essential for making machine learning work. And the progress that we've witnessed in machine learning over the last 15 years is as much an artifact of good data sets as it is of anything else. Okay, there are other techniques that machine learning uses. One approach is called reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is essentially you just let the machine experiment and you give it rewards. So it tries to do something and you say good or bad, you tell it that was a good thing to do or that was a bad thing to do. It does something else. You say that was a good thing or a bad thing to do. And the idea is over time, the machine learns in this particular circumstances, experience has shown me that this was the right thing to do. And the experience here is in the form of rewards that you're getting, rewards that we are giving it. Okay, reinforcement learning is, like many areas in machine learning, has made huge progress, and I'll show you in the next slide one example of a system where it's that demonstrates this, but it has limitations. One limitation is that it's difficult to make reinforcement learning work in the real world. Why? Because if you've got a robot in the real world, we simply can't afford to let it experiment, right? I mean, we can't train driverless cars by just letting them on the roads and doing reinforcement learning, because mayhem would result, death and mayhem would result. So reinforcement learning just doesn't work there. The solution to that is to try and build simulators to allow us to have robots in simulated environments, but actually they are still at a rather primitive state. So reinforcement learning is limited there. The other problem, well, there are many problems with reinforcement learning, but one of the other ones is that we need to give it rewards, and we can inadvertently train it to do things that we don't want it to do if the reward scheme that we develop is not well thought out. Okay, so that's a subtle point, but the idea is if we are giving the rewards and thereby training the machine, if the reward scheme that we've constructed is not well designed, we can inadvertently train the machine with perverse behaviors. Okay, so how do we do the training? Well, the headline technique, which has taken the AI world, well, I mean, it's an understatement to say it's taken it by storm, but it's the dominant technique now, is neural networks. Neural networks, as the name suggests, take their idea from the microstructure of the brain, the human brain or indeed animal brains. Look at the brain under a suitably powered microscope, and you will see that within the brain are a large number of very large networks of interconnected nerve cells called neurons. And they're hugely interconnected. There are billions and billions, the order of 100 billion of these neurons in the brain in total, and they're massively interconnected. So each neuron is communicating with very large numbers, thousands of other neurons, and it's taking inputs from very large numbers of other neurons. And each nerve cell is doing a trivial, tiny, simple computational task. So here I've drawn a highly stylized, not very interesting neural network. And we've got an input layer. This is where the inputs to the neural network are coming. We've got an output layer, which is where the outputs are produced from. And we've got what's called a hidden layer, which is where the work is done in the neural network. Now, if we look at the hidden layer, these purple circles are supposed to be neurons. Each neuron is receiving inputs from the hidden layer, right? So think of this this input layer. Each of the inputs on the input layer, think of it as being a pixel in a picture, right? So which is either on or off. Okay, and what the hidden layer is doing is it's receiving signals from each of the input layers, from each of the elements in the input layer, which is either in or on or off. So each of these inputs it's receiving is either on or off. Now, the simplest way that a neural network works, what's called a perceptron, is it looks at those inputs, and if the weights of the edges that it's receiving, the weights of the incoming edges exceeds a certain threshold, then the neuron is activated and it produces an output. That is, it's this output link becomes active. Think of it as being set to 1. So the simplest way that a neuron can work is looking at these inputs. If it's receiving more than a certain threshold number of activated inputs, then it produces an output, okay, which feeds into the output layer. And then in this case, the output layer is doing something similar. It's just saying if I'm receiving more than a certain number of these activated inputs, then I produce an output. So this neural network isn't doing anything interesting. The next slide shows a slightly more complex, although by today's standards, completely insignificant neural network with a few more layers. So the first thing is more sophisticated networks have more layers, and there are more neurons in those layers. So again, think of this input layer as being the pixels on an image. This doesn't come out terribly well. It's the picture of a lion, but think of each of these input layer elements as being a pixel. To make things simple, think of it being on or off. The first layer elements are receiving a number of those input layer element inputs, and what they're doing is if those inputs match a certain pattern, for example, if the value of the inputs exceeds a certain threshold, then this neuron produces an output, and you'll see in this case it's highly interconnected, so it's giving that output to a large number of other neurons. Okay, so in fact, what typically goes on in a neural network is that these edges, these inputs are weighted. They're attached to numeric weights. And what the neuron does is it computes a function of those weights. And the simplest function it computes is just to add those weights together. And if those weights exceed a certain threshold, as I said previously, then we generate an output. But actually, the function that it computes can be more sophisticated than that. The one that I just described, where it's on or off, is basically a step function. It's either off or it goes on. But you can have more sophisticated functions that are being computed by these neurons. But nevertheless, the computations that those neurons are doing is extremely simple. Okay, so then training this neural network so that when it's shown a picture of a lion, it produces the output lion on the output layer just means fixing the weights of the neural network so that you get the right neurons activated. So how do you fix the weights? That's the big challenge. That's where the science and algorithmics of neural networks comes in. The standard technique for doing that now is a technique called gradient descent. It's actually a very old algorithm, but required some scientific advances and as well as lots of compute power to be able to make it work on neural networks that were big enough to do anything interesting. So that's the basic idea about a neural network. Remember, all a neural network reduces to is weights on those edges. And training a neural network in the way that I described here, where we have the pictures of Alan Turing and the desired output, just means adjusting those weights through a training process. And backpropagation is the standard algorithm for doing that. Okay, let me see, I've talked enough. Let's see a video example. This is a DeepMind's Atari player, and this was the program which made me wake up to the reality of deep learning. Deep, by the way, really just means more deeper networks that are more interconnected with more neurons in them. So it's deep in those three sense, more layers, more neurons in each layer, more interconnection. So DeepMind's Atari player was a program that played all of Atari's 8-bit video console games. And the crucial thing is there are no cheats. All the program sees is the screen, in other words, the pixels on the screen and the score. And remember, if we in the top-down approach to do this, what we would have need to have done is we would have talked to an expert Atari player, found out how they played the game, the knowledge that they used when they played the game, encoded that in a form like Meisson's rules, and given that to the program. None of that happens here. The program doesn't know anything about any of the games. It sees the screen and the score, and the controller that it has is just a joystick with a single fire button, which is, as the older members of the audience will remember, exactly the controller that you had for these Atari 8-bit consoles. And it trains itself using reinforcement learning, what's called deep reinforcement learning. The way that it does it is using neural networks, and it learns over time how to play the game. So let's see. And after 100 games, it's pretty rubbish. If it gets it, if it hits the ball, it's basically doing it pretty much by accident, but most of the time it's missing. But there you go. Okay, so reinforcement learning, it knocks a brick out and it immediately gets a reward. Immediately gets a reward. Gets a reward. Gets a reward, and so on, right? Now, it's immediate. It's one of the interesting things about Breakout. It's immediately getting those rewards. Now, after 400 training episodes, it's never missing the ball. It's reliably getting a ball and bouncing the ball back. Although you'll notice, I'm paused it for a second, just watch the behavior of the bat. The bat is kind of going like this, right? Now, in humans, typically don't do that, right? So why has it got that behavior? Because there was nothing in the reward scheme, and that's just the reward scheme here is just the score that it's getting. There's nothing in the reward scheme to tell it not to do that. It's, you know, there's nothing in the reward scheme that tells it that you'll get a higher score if you keep your bat put. We do that because that's just, you know, kind of reflecting how we would behave, for example, in a game of, if we were playing a game of tennis or something similar. But let's look what happens if we play the game for longer. This is the point at which it finds a strategy which people had forgotten was in the game of Breakout. It discovers that the quickest way to get a score is to drill a hole through the top of the board, and then you very, very, very quickly accumulate a score. So very often when people see this, and it is remarkable, it's genuinely remarkable that it did that, they think, well, you know, again, you're tempted to believe that this machine had a sudden insight, that it suddenly saw, aha, I can do this, I can drill through. No, that's not what it was doing. This program is just a simple program which is optimized to do one tiny task very, very, very well. And it's just repeated. It's optimized by playing this again and again and again. And the optimization is in the form of adjusting its neural networks to try to do that. So there was no sudden insight. There was no understanding of what was going on there. It's just optimization process repeatedly over time. But nevertheless, the fact that it does that is really quite remarkable. So it was a breakthrough achievement. I think it was a lovely achievement in the story of AI. And it's impressive, particularly because the sensory input is the same that we get. It sees the screen and nothing else. But there is one other thing, which is that it knows what the score is. And in the game of Breakout, as I've already said, it immediately gets feedback on whether it's doing well or badly. So let me ask you, do you know what your score in life is? And the answer is really no. And it's like, goes back to the example of smoking, right? The problem is the consequences of our day-to-day actions are often not apparent until a long time in the future. And we find it very hard to adjust our behavior on the idea of some potential future reward, which is nebulous and distant. And for tasks where the reward lies a long time in the future, these approaches don't work terribly well. But also it can't explain what it's learned or what its strategy is. It can't transfer its expertise or generalize or apologize or rationalize in any sense. All its expertise is reduced to the numbers in its neural networks. And those numbers for us are a black box. We have no way of interpreting them. So just to reflect for a moment on neural AI and why it's so successful at the moment, the challenge is really all about finding the weights on those edges. Neural networks are a very old approach. Originally, they were proposed in the 1940s, but nobody had any idea how to train them. There were breakthroughs. The gradient descent algorithm that I've described dates back in its present form to the 1980s. But it's worked really over the last 15 years. Why? There have certainly been algorithmic breakthroughs, but really lots of training data and lots of computer power. We're in the age of big data. We have huge amounts of data available, and cheap computer power is widely available. So what I now want to do is, I've talked about the technology, and this is the technology that everybody's excited about. Let's talk about its limitations. So this is a standard example that I use. This is a literary example, which of course will mean a great deal, I hope, to this audience. This is the first paragraph of the most famous French novel ever. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of the novel, but in English, Remembrance of Things Past, Swann's Way, by Proust, of course. And you can all read the first paragraph of Proust's famous novel there. Okay, so that's the first paragraph of the novel. Wouldn't it be lovely if we had machines that could translate it? Well, if we give this paragraph to a human translator, this is the translation in English of that paragraph by a very famous translation from, I think, the 1930s. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Sometimes when I put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly, I'd not even time to say, I'm going to sleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I tried to put away the book, which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I'd been thinking all the time while I was asleep of what I'd been reading. But my thoughts had run into a channel of their own until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book, and so on. Okay, so I have fragments of schoolboy French. I'm embarrassed to say I don't speak French. So great, this is a lot better for me, but actually quite a lot of it is still obscure to me. What is he talking about where I've become the subject of my book, a church, a quartet? The subject of my book, a quartet? What on earth is he talking about? I've no idea. I'm sure you all do. The rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. I've no idea what he's talking about there. So, you know, I can see this is literary English, but actually quite a lot of it's still obscure to me. Plug this into Google Translate, as I did a couple of years ago, and this is what we get. Long time I went to bed early. Sometimes when my eyes would close so quickly I'd no time to say I fall asleep. Well, we don't have to get very far. The first two sentences immediately tell you, you know, this is not a good translation. This is not a human translation. Long time I went to bed early. You know, a child wouldn't say that, right? Sometimes when my eyes would close so quickly I'd no time to say I fall asleep. It's not grammatical. It doesn't make sense in English. You know, an 11-year-old child would not produce that as a native English-speaking child would not produce that as a sentence. So it's the same words, and it's kind of recognizably the same text, but is not the product of understanding. It is obvious, right, when we look at this, that there is no understanding at work there. And why should there be understanding? Basically, the way that Google Translate works is its neural networks have been translated by lots of French text, English text, French text, English text, French text, English text, and the neural networks learn the likeliest translation, the likeliest mapping from this phrase or this sentence to this phrase or this sentence. Okay, that's all they do. They're optimized to do that. There is no reflection on what the text means or There is no reflection on what is the most appropriate, spiritually the most appropriate metaphor that you might use to translate this metaphor that Proust was using. There is none of that. There is no understanding of earlier 20th century French society, right? There is no understanding of what Proust's concerns were, okay? There is none of that. It's just a program which has been optimized to do one thing as well as it possibly can do. That's all it is, a program which is optimized to do that, mapping from French sentence to likeliest English translation. Having said that, I think it's one of the frustrations of working in our field is that people don't understand how bloody good what we're seeing here is. This is one of the miracles of the modern age. The fact that we have computer programs that can do translations of this quality. This is one of the ancient dreams of humanity. This goes back to the Tower of Babel that appeared in the Bible. It's an ancient dream, and we've given it to people and they take it for granted, they take it for granted and then they complain that it's not perfect. Okay. So, but nevertheless, the point is to illustrate the limitations. There is no understanding at work. There is no understanding of Proust's concerns, of French society, of what Proust was trying to communicate in his text and so on. So here's another example to illustrate the same idea. This is 6 words, 6-word dialogue due to Steven Pinker. I'm leaving you, says Bob, and Anne says, who is she? Now, immediately, all of you had a rich mental picture associated with that story. You can immediately, maybe some of you are living it. And if you're living it, then I apologize to you for bringing back, bringing back bad memories. You've all got a rich picture. Anne and Bob are in a relationship. They're probably married. They've been in a relationship for a while, probably. Bob has found somebody else that he prefers to Anne and has decided to leave Anne. And Anne wants to know who she is, who that is. We can conclude that Bob is probably heterosexual. We can conclude that Anne is probably angry and so on. Just from that tiny sliver of a conversation, we've got a rich mental picture. Now, if we go back to Google Translate, you can translate those words from English to French, from French to Arabic, from Arabic to Russian, and then back to English, and you'll get the same 6 words coming back at you. But nowhere is there any understanding in the way that you had? And how could there be? Right? Because the machine does not have your experience of the human world. Your ability to understand that is rooted in your experience of the human world, of human beings and their beliefs and their desires and their aspirations, and your understanding of relationships, which either you've experienced or you've witnessed in other people, and your ability when you witness it in other people to put yourself in their place and to understand what they are going through. We can get a perfect translation of that without any understanding whatsoever. Okay. And of course, that doesn't matter for the translation purposes. The point is to illustrate what these programs are doing is they are highly optimized programs which do a mapping from this text here in this language to this text here in this language. That's all they're doing and all they aspire to be doing. Okay, what's going on in this picture? Okay, so some of you will know, some of you won't know, there's a long-running British TV show called Doctor Who, and for a while the character playing the main character, the actor playing the main character is a man called Matt Smith. He was a great doctor. I loved it when he was there. You won't recognize the other man. He's my late grandfather-in-law. But I've told you that this is the actor Matt Smith. So then I could ask you some questions. What's in his pocket? So if we were in an audience, you could answer this directly. What do we see in his pocket there? Well, he's an actor. That's probably a script, because actors have scripts when they're on set. What's in his hand? Well, it's a cup of, you might think in France it's a cup of coffee. In England, it's more likely to be tea, of course. So are they filming at the moment? Well, if he's got his script in his pocket, he's holding a cup of tea, probably not. They're probably not filming at the moment. If I ask you what's around them, you will tell me, well, there are cameras, there are lights, there's probably a catering truck since he has a cup of tea, and so on. You could fill in all of that information. So if we ask state-of-the-art artificial intelligence to interpret that picture, and this is Microsoft's Caption Bot, and you can upload pictures to Caption Bot and it will try to interpret them. It says, I think it's Matt Smith posing for a picture and they're smiling. Okay, so great. what it's doing here is basically what I showed you with Alan Turing earlier on. It's doing a little bit more. It's doing a little bit of interpretation. It's interpreting that they seem to be happy. It's recognizing that they've got smiles on their faces. But really, it's not doing any more than that. And in fact, the fact that it's Matt Smith there, well, Matt Smith is an actor, right? Wikipedia can tell you that. The fact that he's an actor and he's got some paper in his pocket will allow you to sort of, a reasonable conclusion, a default conclusion, to use the AI term, would be that, it's a script and that what he's holding in his hand is a cup of tea. It isn't managing to do any of that. This is an incredibly narrow interpretation of what's going on here. It's incredibly narrow interpretation. That neural network is optimized to produce this single output, Matt Smith, in exactly the same way that I told you. There is no understanding. We are able to recognize Matt Smith and use our knowledge of the fact that Matt Smith is an actor, and the actors are on set with tea breaks and scripts and so on, and fill in all of the other details and build a rich story around that. And our understanding of this might be related to our experience of, of coming across film sets in the human world and so on. Here's another example. This is a really cruel one. You will all recognize pictures. I seem to be very French focused in my examples here in these slides. Well, you should take that as a compliment. So this is Van Gogh, Starry Night. So let's see what CaptionBot makes of that. It says, I'm not really confident, but I think it's a couple of animals that are in the water. Well, that's a cheap laugh for all of us. Of course, that's not what CaptionBot is supposed to do. But actually, what's remarkable about this is CaptionBot doesn't understand that it's not looking at a photograph like this, right? It doesn't understand. You could feed it a gibberish image and it would say something like, I think it's a couple of animals that are in the water. It doesn't even know that it's not looking at a photograph, right? And actually, I would have thought somebody would have uploaded Starry Night by now to CaptionBot and it would be able to interpret that. But this is just showing you that neural network is trying to do the best mapping that it can. In this case, the best mapping is a couple of animals that are in the water, and at least it recognizes it's not confident, but it doesn't even know that it's not looking at a photograph. There is no understanding there. Okay. So what I want to emphasize by this is machine learning is really to do with automated programming. I mean, machine learning, the term machine learning for us, the idea is what it suggests to us is that we can lock a computer away, with a few books and it will come out being intelligent. That's not what it's doing. It sort of implies machines bootstrapping their own intelligence. Really, all it's doing is it's enabling us to generate programs that we don't otherwise know how to write, subroutines that we don't otherwise know how to create, like for doing facial recognition. And, these programs that are generated by machine learning, we can then use as subroutines in our AI programs. If we want a subroutine to recognize faces in pictures, we can call on the machine learning subroutine. But that's all that's going on. It's basically a kind of automated programming. I've already touched on this point, but DeepMind's Atari program, it's just worth highlighting. One of the games that did very badly on was, I think it got a score of 0, was called Montezuma's Revenge. And this is a kind of weird platform game where you have to do long chains of complicated and silly tasks in order to get a reward. And the point is, unlike Breakout, that reward was a long time in the future, and the program could not associate its actions now with that reward that it was getting a long term in the future. So challenges like that are very difficult for these long-term reasoning tasks. It works best where you're in some state, you perform some action and you immediately get a reward, like in Breakout. But when the reward is a long time in the future, then the program doesn't work these techniques don't work too well. Understanding causal reasoning is difficult for machine learning. So here is some genuine text. The British people voted to leave the EU, Brexit. Donald Trump was elected president of the USA. And then what happened next? Angela Merkel decided to step down as German chancellor. The sentences are true, but the overall paragraph is implying a causal connection which is not present. And the causal connection is implied by, and what happened then? And we can see that there is no causal connection between Angela Merkel deciding to step down and Brexit and Donald Trump, but current AI can't remotely handle this. And one of the reasons that they can't remotely handle this is that it requires background understanding of Angela Merkel, Donald Trump, and British people. And we don't know how to give that background understanding. So understanding causal reasoning of this type is very difficult for AI. And it's one of the challenges for AI systems detecting fake news. Is because this is kind of fake news. It's implying that, you know, a causal connection there, Angela Merkel deciding to step down as a consequence of Brexit and Donald Trump, which is not true. So causality, programs that can understand causality, is very difficult for these kinds of machine learning programs. Common sense reasoning. So machine learning programs that have been trained on neural networks are good at interpolation, less good at extrapolation. Or put it another way, they're very good when they encounter situations which are like those that have been in their training data, but bad when they encounter situations outside their training data. So the way to illustrate that is look at the picture on the right. So here we see a picture of a truck. In fact, it's a fire truck, which is on fire. So imagine you're in a driverless car, which has been trained for thousands of hours on the road, but it's never encountered a truck on fire. It just doesn't know how to make sense of that. It can't interpret that. The best match that its neural network, remember, its neural network saying, here is this image that I'm seeing. How should I interpret that? Well, the neural network says, well, it's an obstacle in the road or a parked truck, let's say. And what do we do when we encounter a parked truck? My training says we drive around it, right? But in the human world, you would never do that. You encounter a truck on fire. What are you going to do? You're going to stop. You're going to very carefully check to see whether somebody needs rescuing. You're going to call 911. You're not just going to treat it as an obstacle and drive around it. So we can do that because we have abilities that go beyond just mapping this particular situation to this particular action. We have common sense reasoning capability, the ability to think out of the box that goes beyond just simple training data. This is basically, I would say, this is why driverless car technology is not on the road wide scale right now at the moment, because there is a long tail of unlikely situations which Waymo and other driverless car companies who spent thousands, if not millions of hours driving their cars on the roads have not yet encountered. There's a long tail of very unlikely situations which might be encountered by a driverless car. And when a driverless car encounters a situation that it hasn't encountered before, it doesn't know what to do with that. So I guess one of the messages that I want to get across in this talk is that artificial intelligence and machine learning are not the same thing. So artificial intelligence is not the same as machine learning. It's a subset of artificial intelligence. And it's the subset of artificial intelligence which is concerned with automatic programming by learning from training data, typically. I've already explained, and actually I should have had that slide on automatic programming immediately before this one. It would perhaps have made more sense. But you remember I said what machine learning is concerned with is doing automatic programming, being able to learn to map this input to this output without explicitly being trained what to do. And once we've trained a machine learning routine, we can use it as a subroutine in our programming. But the goals of artificial intelligence are much richer than that. The long-term goals of artificial intelligence include things like machines that can do common sense reasoning, like we saw on the previous slide. Machine learning has very successfully developed techniques to learn associations, universal function approximators, and that's an incredibly useful and powerful thing to do. But having that does not add up to artificial intelligence. And what do I mean by that? You can have a subroutine that will do facial recognition, and a subroutine that will do automated translation, and a subroutine which will do handwriting recognition, and a subroutine which will drive cars, and a subroutine which will make omelets, and a subroutine which will tie shoelaces, and you can carry on, right? All of those things, all of these things that you can do and that I can do, having subroutines that can do all of those does not add up to our intelligence. It doesn't add up to artificial intelligence. Or to put it another way, we don't understand how to use those subroutines in the process of building an entire intelligent agent, and a whole intelligent agent in the sense of the dream of AI. Those narrow advances don't add up to general advances. Okay, so the task of building a whole intelligent agent remains a huge challenge. So what about general AI? Well, the first thing to say, I am a skeptic. I mean, there is a division of opinion in the community. Some people are much less skeptical than me. I am a skeptic that we will see it anytime soon. I don't think it's logically impossible. I see no reason why it's not logically possible. But I think Skynet intelligent explosions of the kind, you know, that were made popular in the Terminator scenario, and let's be honest, in the Singularity scenario, are very unlikely. Apart from anything else, you know, the idea that you could suddenly have AI systems that can communicate with each other, and then this multiplies their intelligence. Having worked for 30 years trying to build AI systems that can add their intelligence together, I know how difficult that is, and I don't see any sudden Skynet intelligent explosions. Current advances are very narrow and task focused, and we don't know how to put those together to make a conscious agent or a generally intelligent agent. And my sense is that we will see plenty of signs, if it happens, before it happens. And there's a nice analogy, which I wish I could claim as my own, but it actually belongs to Rod Brooks. And it goes as follows. So think of general intelligence as being a Boeing 747, right? Well, a Boeing 747 wasn't invented by somebody in a shed at the end of their garden. You know, it wasn't invented overnight. It didn't happen as a result of some sudden, you know, sudden light bulb genius moment. That's not where it came from. It came as a consequence of a very long engineering process built on a very, very long track record of engineering experience. You know, before a Boeing 747, there was a 737 and a 727 and so on. And moreover, the chief goal that the engineers had in mind when they built the Boeing 747 was safety. And I think it's a nice analogy, because I think if we do see general intelligence, it's going to arise in something like the same way. You know, we will see plenty of signs, won't take us by surprise. And I believe, I hope, and I believe that safety will be the #1 priority. So if I'm not worried about Skynet intelligence explosions, what kinds of things am I worried about? Well, we do see stories of AI and so on with alarming stories associated with contemporary AI. So what things do I think we need to worry about? Well, unemployment. I don't think AI is poised to take all our jobs, but that doesn't mean that it won't take some jobs. And here's a quote from Andrew Ng that we saw earlier, who said, any decision a person can make in 1 second, we can automate with AI. If your job involves looking at a form which has some data on, and they're just making a yes/no decision based on that data, we can probably automate it with AI. Whether we should do is another question, but we probably can automate it with AI. Jobs that will resist artificial intelligence, I think, are things like jobs that involve human skills, and teachers and doctors involve human skills. Jobs involving creativity, so scientists, artists, and so on. Those kinds of jobs are going to be safe. But repetitive jobs that involve simple decision making, we can automate with AI. Privacy is a real concern. Computers can recognize faces in pictures better than people can. You know, cameras are being embedded everywhere in our environment. The UK is notorious for this. There are some good things you can do with that. It's had a huge impact on solving crimes, but it has scary possibilities as well. So privacy is a concern. Fake news and altered reality. If we have AI programs that can develop fake news stories on a vast scale, plausible sounding fake news stories, and you go on Twitter and there are vastly more AI programs generating fake news than people generating real news, then that's a scary possibility. Autonomous weaponry, the idea of weapons that can decide whether to take a human life, I think is a real concern that we all need to take seriously. Algorithmic alienation, what if AI is your boss and it decides whether you are promoted or lose your job? And I actually saw yesterday stories of AI programs, there was a story in the Financial Times, of deciding whether AI programs looking at a CV and deciding whether somebody makes it to a shortlist of a job interview. That's kind of scary and very alienating. And finally, algorithmic bias. If the training data that we use to train our bank program on whether somebody should get a bank loan is biased, then if that training data is biased, then the AI program that we end up with is going to be biased. So these, for me, these are the headline things that I think AI researchers need to be concerned about in the near term. If you're still frightened of AI, let's see this video from 2015. This is a program organized by DARPA, the US military. This is a competition organized by DARPA, the US military organization. And it's to do with dexterity in robots. So you get a robot to do a dexterous task, in this case, opening a door. It's not a fake, it's a completely real video, and it utterly failed to open the door. So dexterity, turns out, in people, we don't have robots that are anywhere near as dexterous as a human hand at the moment. So the standard joke, I wish it was mine, but it's not, if you're worried about the robot apocalypse, then just close your door. You don't need to lock your door, just close your door and you'll be safe, at least for the time being. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I know that will have been a familiar story to some of you. I hope that all of it wasn't familiar to all of you. I hope you learned something from it and enjoyed it. As Sebastian said, I published this book, The Road to Conscious Machines, The Story of AI. There is no French translation at the moment, but if somebody's interested, I'd love to hear from you. There's the US version with the bad language removed is also available, A Brief History of AI. It's slightly shorter, but covers basically the same book. And if you found this talk interesting, then you are heartily recommended to refer to those. So I am about done. I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk and nice introduction as I expected for all the discussion during these 2 days. And so if you have questions, we activated mic for everyone.